My son told me straight up, standing in my kitchen in Evanston, Illinois, that my two youngest grandkids weren't invited to the party. He said it calmly, like he was discussing the weather or a grocery list, leaning against the counter with his hands in his pockets. His wife was upstairs, packing for their weekend trip. It was her birthday party they were planning, a big one, and apparently the guest list was tight. My small house felt even smaller then, the air thick and still. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything unsaid, years of small slights and calculated omissions that had led us to this moment. I remember looking at the clock on the microwave, the red numbers staring back, unblinking, counting time that felt suddenly meaningless. It was early afternoon, the sun bright outside, but inside, everything had just gone dim. He didn't look at me when he said it. His gaze was fixed somewhere over my shoulder, towards the window perhaps, or maybe just avoiding my eyes. He mentioned the venue size, the catering limits, the adults-only nature of the event, reasons that sounded reasonable if you didn't know the context, if you didn't know how much those two little boys, Ethan and Sam, adored parties, how they talked about everything their parents did, how they looked forward to seeing all their cousins. They were 5 and 7, not babies who needed constant supervision, but old enough to understand exclusion, old enough to feel the sting of being left out, old enough to ask me later why they weren't there when everyone else was. That was the part that twisted in my gut. Having to look into their hopeful faces and explain something I couldn't even comprehend myself. It wasn't just about a party. It was about their place in the family, their visibility, their worthiness in the eyes of their own father and stepmother. It was about my place, too, implicitly. The grandmother whose grandchildren were an inconvenience, a number on a guest list that needed to be cut. The dignity I thought I had maintained through years of navigating this complicated family dynamic seemed to evaporate on the spot, leaving me feeling exposed and foolish. My hands, which had been holding the dish rag, felt suddenly heavy and useless. I wanted to ask why, to plead, to demand an explanation that made sense, but the words caught in my throat. There was a cold finality in his tone, a detachment that shut down any possibility of appeal. He wasn't asking for my understanding. He was delivering a decision, a verdict. And the subjects weren't just my grandsons, but also the unspoken bond I shared with them, the joy they brought me that apparently didn't fit into the carefully curated image of this adults-only celebration. The dish rag slipped from my fingers and landed softly on the floor, a small, unheard sound in the suffocating quiet. It felt like more than just a cleaning cloth hitting the linoleum. It felt like something inside me had dropped too, shattering silently into a million tiny pieces that I wasn't sure I could ever put back together. He still hadn't looked at me. He checked his watch then, a small, dismissive gesture that said his time with me was limited, that this unpleasant conversation was just a hurdle to get over before moving on to the important things, like packing for the party. If you've lived through something like this, let me know where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious who else this resonates with. He finally met my eyes then, a brief, almost clinical glance. "Mom," he said, his voice softening just slightly, a performative attempt at empathy that felt hollow. "It's just this one party. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal." The words hung in the air. Not a big deal that two little boys would feel left out, that their grandmother's heart was breaking, that a line was being drawn through the family structure, designating some members as welcome and others as inconvenient. I managed to find my voice, but it came out small, reedy, not my own. "But why?" I asked, hating the sound of my own desperation. "They're your sons. They're family," he sighed, a weary, put-upon sound. "I told you, Mom. Guest list. Venue. It's for Sarah's friends, mostly, and our older cousins. The little kids would just be bored anyway. Bored. The boys who loved running around, who found wonder in the simplest things, who would have been thrilled just to included, to wear a party hat, to eat a piece of cake, they wouldn't have been bored. They would have been happy. They would have felt loved. But their happiness, their feeling of being loved, wasn't the priority. The priority was the tight guest list, the adult ambiance, the image Sarah wanted to project for her friends and selected family. I looked past him, towards the stairs where I could hear the faint sounds of Sarah moving around upstairs. I pictured her, organized and efficient, probably already checking off items on a mental list, oblivious or indifferent to the emotional wreckage being created downstairs. It was always like this. Small decisions made without considering the ripple effect. The human cost. My role, for years, had been to absorb these impacts, to smooth things over, to pretend it didn't hurt, for the sake of keeping the peace, for the sake of maintaining some semblance of a relationship with my son and access to my grandchildren. I had swallowed so much over the years, let so many things slide, told myself I was being the bigger person, being understanding. But this felt different. This felt like a deliberate erasure, not just of the boys, but of my connection to them, of the natural order of family. A grandmother should see her grandchildren at family events. It was a given, a fundamental right almost. To have that right revoked, casually, dismissively, was a deep wound. I wanted to scream, to argue, to tell him he was making a terrible mistake, that he was hurting his own children, but the years of restraint held me back. I had learned that strong emotions, honest reactions, were often met with defensiveness, withdrawal, or accusations of being difficult or over-emotional. So I stayed silent, my face, I hoped, betraying none of the storm raging inside me. He seemed to take my silence as acceptance. He pushed off the counter, a small smile touching his lips. Okay, Mom. Just wanted to let you know. We'll see you soon. Gotta finish packing. He gave me a quick, awkward pat on the shoulder as he passed. A gesture that was meant to be affectionate, perhaps, but felt like a final dismissal. The front door opened and closed, the sound echoing in the sudden emptiness of the house. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing in, the image of his retreating back burned into my mind. The dish rag was still on the floor. I looked down at it, then slowly, deliberately bent to pick it up. My hand trembled slightly. I walked to the sink and ran it under cold water, wringing it out slowly, focusing on the physical sensation, anything to distract from the cold, hard lump forming in my chest. The water ran clear. The rag was clean, but I felt stained, somehow diminished. This wasn't just about a party. It was about respect. It was about love. It was about whether my grandchildren, my blood, were considered integral parts of this family or merely optional extras, easily discarded when the guest list got tight. And the answer delivered today was brutal in its simplicity and its casual cruelty. The next few days were quiet, outwardly. The house in Evanston felt like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. I went through the motions. I made tea in the morning, watered the plants, read the local paper. But underneath the routine, the conversation with my son played on repeat. The words, his tone, the brief, avoiding glance. Each memory was a fresh prick. I didn't call the boys. I couldn't bring myself to talk to them, knowing I'd have to navigate around the subject of the party. Knowing they might mention it, ask if they were going, and I'd have to lie or deflect. Something I wasn't prepared to do. And I certainly didn't call Sarah. There was no point. I knew instinctively that the decision had been hers, or at least strongly influenced by her. She was meticulous about appearances, about curating their life into a perfect, glossy image. Two young, potentially noisy boys didn't fit that image for a sophisticated adult party. It wasn't malice, not exactly. It was worse. It was indifferent. They simply didn't factor into her equation of what made a desirable guest list. This wasn't the first time I'd felt the edges of their carefully constructed world push against the messier, more organic reality of extended family. There had been the Christmas when they'd insisted on only gender-neutral gifts, then barely concealed their disappointment when the boys opened bright red fire trucks. There had been the summer visit, cut short because the boys were too loud for their minimalist house. There had been the constant subtle corrections of the boys' behavior, their clothes, their interests, all measured against some invisible standard I didn't understand. Each instance on its own was minor, easy to dismiss, to rationalize. But cumulatively, they formed a pattern, a slow, steady chipping away at the warmth and spontaneity that should define a family. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, was a corporate lawyer. Efficient, polished, used to getting her way. My son, Mark, had always been easily influenced, eager to please, especially Sarah. His career was doing well. They lived in a desirable neighborhood just outside of Chicago proper. Their house was always immaculate. They presented a picture of success. And maybe, in that picture, my two boisterous, messy, perfectly normal grandsons were a smudge. I walked through the rooms of my house, a place filled with the clutter of a life lived, of memories made. Photos on shelves, slightly worn furniture, books piled on tables. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And it was a place where the boys were always welcome, always celebrated, just as they were. The contrast was stark. Their world of curated perfection felt cold. My world, messy as it was, felt warm. For years, I had tried to bridge that gap, to fit into their mold, to make myself and my home less disruptive. I'd bought new slipcovers, tried to minimize the toys when they visited, bitten back comments, all in the service of access to my grandchildren. It felt like I had been performing for their approval. And today's news was the ultimate critique. I wasn't good enough. My grandchildren weren't good enough to be part of their significant moments. I sat down in my armchair by the window, looking out at the quiet street in Evanston. People walking dogs, cars driving slowly by. Normal life happening, but my internal landscape felt like a war zone. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a quiet, simmering anger. Not a loud, explosive anger, but a deep, cold one that settled in my bones. It was the anger of being dismissed, of having something precious devalued. It was the anger of seeing my grandsons treated as less than. I had spent so long trying to be the understanding, accommodating mother-in-law, the non-disruptive grandmother. I had given up so much space, so much of my own comfort and truth. In that effort, and for what? To still have my family unit, my connection to my grandsons, treated as an afterthought. The feeling of powerlessness was the worst part. What could I do? Call and beg? Argue? They had made their decision. It was final. I was stuck with the hurt, the exclusion, and the knowledge that my grandsons would feel it too, eventually. Or maybe Mark and Sarah would just tell them the party was for grown-ups. Another small lie in a pattern of creating a reality that suited them. That evening, I ate dinner alone at my small kitchen table. The silence in the house was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about all the family gatherings I'd hosted in this house. The Thanksgivings crammed with cousins and aunts and uncles. The Christmases overflowing with presents and wrapping paper. The birthdays marked by cake and laughter. The boys had always been at the center of those gatherings. Their shrieks of joy, their sticky fingers on everything, their boundless energy. That was what made it feel like family. The idea of a family celebration that deliberately excluded them felt like a perversion of the word family. It felt like something essential had been surgically removed. I remembered a conversation with my own mother years ago when my kids were small. She told me being a grandmother was a second chance, a different kind of love, less burdened by the anxieties of parenting. Purer in its affection, she said to cherish every moment because they grew up so fast, and I had cherished them. Every messy hug, every whispered secret, every drawing stuck on my refrigerator. Their faces, when they smiled up at me, were pure sunshine. To think that sun was being dimmed, even slightly, by the actions of their own father was unbearable. I pulled out an old photo album from the bookshelf in the living room. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as I opened it, pages filled with pictures of Mark as a child, then a teenager, then a young man, and then the first pictures of Ethan, tiny and new, held in Mark's arms. Pictures of Sam, a few years later, pictures of me holding them, feeding them, playing with them on the floor. Happy moments, frozen in time. Were these memories meaningless to Mark now? Had his new life, his polished image with Sarah, somehow erased the value of these earlier, simpler times? The thought was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I flipped through the pages, my fingers tracing the outlines of the children's faces. Ethan's serious gaze, Sam's wide, curious eye. They deserved better than to be deemed inconvenient. They deserved to be celebrated. Not just tolerated, not just included when it was easy, but truly, wholeheartedly welcomed and cherished. The house was quiet, but inside me, the anger was solidifying, hardening. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was a realization. I had spent years trying to fit into their world, adapting myself, making myself smaller. What if I stopped? What if I didn't try to meet their expectations, but instead focused on creating a space where my grandchildren were unconditionally loved and celebrated, a space entirely separate from the one that had excluded them? The idea felt radical, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. It would mean stepping off the path I had been on, the path of quiet compromise and unspoken resentment. It would mean asserting my own boundaries, my own values, even if it created conflict. Conflict was something I had always avoided. I was a former librarian, quiet by nature, used to order and respect. Confrontation felt alien and uncomfortable. But the thought of my grandsons' faces, the potential disappointment or confusion they might feel, outweighed my fear of discomfort. They deserved to know they were important, unequivocally important, to someone. And that someone had to be me. I closed the photo album, the sound echoing in the quiet room. My decision wasn't fully formed yet. The how was still murky, but the what was becoming clear. I couldn't control who invited them to their parties, but I could control who invited them to mine. And I could make my invitation mean something. Something big, something undeniable. Something that said, louder than any exclusion ever could, that they were loved, they were wanted, they belonged. The next morning, the air in Evanston felt crisp and cool. I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. The knot of anxiety was still there, but underneath it was a layer of resolve. I made coffee, strong and black, and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my son had delivered his casual blow. This space, which had felt like a place of defeat, needed to be reclaimed. I pulled out a notebook, a thick spiral-bound one I used for planning my garden or jotting down recipes. This time, I wasn't planning petunias or dinner menus. I was planning something much more significant. What did the boys love? Ethan loved dinosaurs. Sam loved anything with wheels, especially trains. They both loved being outside, running, jumping, making noise. They loved cake, naturally, and pizza. They loved bright colors and balloons. Simple things, the things that made childhood magical. A party for them shouldn't be sophisticated or curated. It should be joyful, chaotic, and entirely focused on what made them happy. I started writing, lists forming on the page. Guest list, Ethan's friends from school. Sam's friends? They're cousins on my side of the family. The ones who would include them? Not the cousins from Mark's side. Not the ones who would be at the other party, who might feel like spies or simply reminders of the exclusion. This party was for Ethan and Sam. The guest list needed to reflect that. Venue. Not my small house. It wouldn't be big enough for the kind of party I was starting to envision. A park? A rented hall? A community center? My mind started whirring with possibilities. I hadn't planned a large event in years, not since retiring from the library. My professional life had involved order and quiet. Planning this felt different. It felt like flexing muscles I hadn't used in a long time. Muscles related to logistics, to coordination, to making things happen. I realized then that my professional background wasn't irrelevant. Being a librarian wasn't just about books. It was about organizing information, managing resources, connecting people with what they needed. And right now, what my grandsons needed was a connection to feeling valued, a resource of unconditional love, and organized effort to show them they mattered. I wrote down Park District Pavilion Rental. That felt right. A public space, open, room to run. The Evanston Park District had several pavilions. I could look online later, check availability and size. The cost would be a factor. I had savings, but they were earmarked for travel, a quiet trip I'd hoped to take next year. That felt trivial now. The boys' joy, their sense of belonging, was infinitely more valuable than any vacation. I made a note to check my savings account balance. This wasn't reckless spending, it was an investment in my relationship with my grandsons, an investment in their happiness, an investment in my own dignity. There was a faint tremor in my hands as I wrote, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the energy, the focus, the sheer momentum of finally acting instead of just reacting or enduring. I realized I was smiling, a small, determined smile. It wasn't a happy smile, not yet. It was a warrior's smile, grim and focused. I wasn't just throwing a party. I was drawing a line in the sand. I was building a fortress of love around my grandsons, a place where the casual cruelties of others couldn't reach them. I needed help, of course. I couldn't do this entirely alone. My friend Carol came to mind. We had worked together for years at the library, before she retired. Carol was practical, no nonsense, and fiercely loyal to her own family. She understood the complexities of adult children and grandchildren. She wouldn't offer platitudes or tell me to just let it go. She would listen, and she would help. I made a note, call Carol. The phone felt heavy in my hand when I finally picked it up. Explaining the situation, the casual brutality of it, was harder than I expected. The words stumbled out, raw and painful. But Carol listened, her silence on the other end of the line, a supportive wait. When I finished speaking, there was a pause. Then Carol's voice came through, steady and strong. "Jean," she said, using my first name in that way that signaled seriousness. "That's unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable." The validation, simple as it was like a balm. It wasn't just me being sensitive, being difficult. It was objectively wrong. So, she continued, her tone shifting into practical mode. "What are you going to do about it?" I took a deep breath and told her about the notebook, the lists, the idea of a party just for Ethan and Sam. I told her about the park pavilion, the dinosaurs and trains, the cake and pizza. I told her it needed to be bigger, not just in size, but in spirit, in heart. A party that would overshadow the one they weren't invited to, not out of spite, but out of overwhelming, undeniable love. A celebration of them, I said, the words solidifying the concept. "Exactly," Carol replied. "And you're doing it right. You're not reacting to them. You're acting for the boys. That's the key." We talked for a long time that afternoon. Carol offered to help with logistics, with planning, with calling around. Her energy was infectious, pulling me further out of the quiet despair I had been sinking into. She suggested specific parks, mentioning the amenities, the playgrounds. She knew a baker who did incredible themed cakes. She had contacts for balloon arches and face painters. Suddenly, the abstract idea started taking concrete shape. It felt real, possible. It felt like a lifeline. We agreed to meet the next day, armed with our notebooks and ideas. Hanging up the phone, I looked at the notes I had scrawled earlier. They no longer felt like a desperate attempt to cope, but like the first steps of a deliberate plan. The feeling of powerlessness had begun to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of agency. I couldn't control their actions, but I could control mine. I could choose to channel the hurt and anger into something positive, something affirming. I wasn't just throwing a party, I was building a statement about what family meant to me, about the unconditional nature of a grandmother's love, about the importance of making children feel seen and valued. The decision to do this, to invest my time, my energy, my money in a counter celebration, felt like a fundamental shift. It wasn't about winning some kind of status game with Mark and Sarah. It was about refusing to accept their definitive family, refusing to let their exclusions dictate my relationship with my grandsons. It was about reclaiming my space, my role, my identity as a grandmother who showed up, who celebrated, who made sure her boys knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were loved unconditionally. The phone call with Carol was the first step out of the quiet paralysis. The planning, the action, would be the next. And for the first time since Mark's call, I felt a flicker of hope, not for reconciliation with him, but for a different path forward, one I was choosing, one I was building myself. The path was uncertain, and there would likely be repercussions, unspoken tensions, perhaps even direct conflict. But I was no longer solely reacting to their moves. I was making my own. And that felt like a powerful, necessary change. Meeting Carol the next day felt like a strategy session. We spread out notebooks, local park district maps, and printouts from websites on her kitchen table in Wilmette, just down the road from Evanston. The aroma of her freshly baked bread filled the air, a comforting domestic backdrop to our quiet rebellion. We talked out the boys' specific interests, listing every dinosaur and train engine they had ever mentioned. We debated bouncy castle sizes and face painting designs. It was planning a party, yes, but every detail felt weighted with a significance beyond mere entertainment. It was about crafting an experience that was tailor-made for them, an experience that said, "You are the center of attention here. You are the reason for this celebration." The contrast with the adults-only party was unspoken but ever present in our minds. Their party was about excluding. Ours was about including. Their party was about adults. Ours was about children. Their party was about status. Ours was about love. "We need to make sure it's on a different day than their party," Carol noted, her finger tracing a date on the calendar. "We don't want the boys to feel like it's a consolation prize. It needs to be its own event, stand on its own." This was crucial. This wasn't a gestion to their exclusion. It was a proactive creation of something positive. It had to feel independent. a celebration born of pure affection, not bitterness. We settled on a date 2 weeks after Mark and Sarah's party. This gave us enough time to plan, and it separated the events clearly. I started making calls that afternoon. The park district was efficient and helpful. I secured a large pavilion with an adjacent playground for the chosen date. It felt like a small victory, a concrete step forward. Then I called the baker Carol recommended. I described Ethan's fascination with Tyrannosaurus Rex and Sam's love for Thomas the Tank Engine. The baker's enthusiasm was a welcome contrast to the detachment I had encountered with my son. She talked about edible $10 fossils and fondant trains, her voice bringing the vision to life. It was more expensive than a store-bought cake, significantly more. But the cost felt less like an expense and more like an investment in a memory. This party wasn't about budget, it was about message. The message to Ethan and Sam: you are worth celebrating, in detail, with effort, with joy. Next were invitations. Who to invite? Definitely my side of the family who were close to the boys. My sister and her husband, their grown kids who still enjoyed spending time with the younger cousins, and the boys' friends from school. I got their parents' contact information from the school directory. Sending out those invitations felt powerful. Each envelope sealed was a quiet act of defiance, a statement that said, my grandchildren are not an inconvenience. They are a joy, and they deserve to be celebrated. There was a quiet satisfaction in writing each name, addressing each envelope. It felt like building something, piece by piece, a structure of love and inclusion to counter the structure of exclusion that had hurt me so deeply. Carol and I worked together seamlessly, like we had in the library, each taking on tasks, checking in, supporting each other. Her presence was invaluable. She didn't just help with the planning, she helped reinforce my resolve, reminding me why I was doing this, keeping the focus on the boys and the positive energy we were creating. There were moments of doubt, brief flashes of anxiety. What if no one came? What if Mark and Sarah reacted negatively? What if the boys somehow still felt the shadow of the other party? But I pushed those thoughts away. This wasn't about them, not anymore. It was about me choosing to act from a place of love and strength rather than react from a place of hurt and powerlessness. It was about creating a memory for my grandsons that was so bright, so full of joy, that it would stand as its own truth, independent of any other narrative. This quiet, deliberate planning felt like a form of healing. Each task completed, each vendor confirmed, each invitation sent, was a step away from the initial shock and pain, a step towards reclaiming my sense of purpose and dignity. The days leading up to their party passed in a blur of planning. I didn't speak to Mark or Sarah about it. There was nothing to say. My actions would speak for me, for the boys. The contrast was becoming sharper in my mind. Their carefully controlled event, our joyful, slightly chaotic celebration. The day of Mark and Sarah's party arrived. I stayed home. I hadn't been invited either, of course, which was par for the course for larger events they hosted. My absence was expected, but the boys' absence was a gaping hole. I tried to distract myself. I worked in the garden, pulling weeds with a ferocity I didn't usually possess. Each weed pulled felt like extracting a small piece of the resentment that had taken root inside me. The physical labor was grounding, a necessary counterpoint to the emotional turmoil. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself checking the time, picturing the party in my mind. The elegant venue they had rented, the sophisticated adult guests, the absence of children's laughter. It felt sterile. I imagined my grandsons at home, perhaps being looked after by a babysitter, or maybe at a grandparent's house on Sarah's side who was also deemed unsuitable for the adults-only affair. Either way, they weren't with their father, celebrating a significant family event. They were excluded. The thought fueled my resolve for the party I was planning. This wasn't just about providing an alternative, it was about demonstrating a different value system. A system where family wasn't edited for convenience or appearance. A system where the youngest members were cherished and included. I spent the evening organizing the party favors for my upcoming event. Small bags filled with dinosaur stickers, mini train whistles, colorful candies. Simple, inexpensive things, but chosen with care, chosen because I knew the boys would love them. As I filled the bags, I thought about the pure, uncomplicated joy these simple items would bring. It was a stark contrast to the calculated effort that had gone into excluding them from the other party. My own private ritual, performed alone in my quiet house on the evening of their exclusion, felt incredibly significant. It was a physical act of nurturing, a tangible preparation for the love I was about to pour out. It was a refusal to be diminished by their actions. It was a quiet assertion of my role, my love, my unwavering commitment to my grandsons. I packed the bags into a large box, sealing it with tape. This box held more than just party favors. It held my intention, my hope, my quiet defiance. I placed it by the front door, ready to be loaded into the car when the day of our party arrived. Sleep didn't come easily that night. My mind was a swirl of emotions, residual hurt from the day's events, anticipation for the party I was planning, a deep, quiet resolve that felt like steel in my spine. I thought about the boys, hoped they weren't feeling the sting of exclusion too sharply, hoped that whatever they were doing, they felt loved and secure. That was the ultimate goal, wasn't it? To protect their innocence, to buffer them from the less kind aspects of adult behavior, to ensure they knew they were precious. My party wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Mark and Sarah feel bad. It was about creating a space where my grandsons could simply be children, celebrated and free. The absence of a call or text from Mark or Sarah, even just a perfunctory, "the party went well," was noted, but didn't surprise me. We existed in parallel universes now, it seemed. Theirs exclusive and polished. Mine, messy and inclusive. I was no longer trying to bridge the gap. I was building my own world. One party favor bag, one phone call, one determined step at a time. This felt like a reclaiming of my own power, not over them, but over myself. I was no longer waiting for permission, no longer seeking validation from those who withheld it. I was acting on my own terms, guided by my own values, fueled by a grandmother's fierce love. And in that quiet act of taking control, I found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The 2 weeks leading up to the party were a flurry of activity. Carol and I finalized details, confirmed RSVPs, and gathered supplies. We ordered the custom cake, a magnificent creation featuring a fondant T-Rex chasing a little blue train. It was almost a shame to cut into it, but the boys' faces when they saw it would be worth every penny. I bought giant helium balloons in bright primary colors: red, blue, yellow. Joyful colors, simple and pure. We arranged for a face painter who specialized in animals and superheroes. These weren't sophisticated choices. They were deliberately, joyfully childish. The focus remained laser sharp. This party was for Ethan and Sam. Every decision was filtered through that lens. I kept the planning separate from my usual life. I didn't talk about it with casual acquaintances. It felt too personal, too important to be subjected to outside commentary. It was my quiet mission. There were no more calls or texts from Mark about the party he and Sarah had hosted. It was as if that chapter was closed, sealed off. The silence was telling. They hadn't included my grandsons. They hadn't included me. And they didn't feel the need to tornado it or its aftermath. This reinforced my decision. I wasn't overreacting. I was responding to a clear message about where I and my grandsons stood in their priorities. I felt a quiet sadness about the distance growing between me and my son, but it was tempered by the anticipation of the joy I was creating for the boys. My priority had shifted. It was no longer about maintaining a fragile connection with Mark on his terms. It was about nurturing a strong, unwavering connection with Ethan and Sam on terms of unconditional love and inclusion. I also started looking into resources related to grandparents' rights, not because I planned any legal action, but because I needed to understand the landscape, to know what options might exist if access to my grandsons became even more restricted. I found information online, read articles about mediating family disputes. It was purely informational, a quiet act of preparation, a way of equipping myself for potential future challenges. It felt like building a foundation, not just for the party, but for the future of my relationship with the boys, a future I was determined to protect. I didn't share this research with anyone, not even Carol. It felt like a private layer of protection, a quiet acknowledgement of the vulnerability inherent in navigating these complex family dynamics. The park pavilion was confirmed, the vendors were booked, the invitations were out. The RSVPs came back steadily, a gratifying affirmation of the love and support that did exist for Ethan and Sam. My side of the family responded with immediate enthusiasm. The parents of the boys' friends were happy for a chance for the kids to get together outside of school. It felt like a counter community forming, built on shared values of inclusion and simple joy. There was a sense of momentum building, a feeling that this party was becoming something more than just a reaction. It was becoming a positive statement, a celebration of the simple, fundamental bonds of family and friendship. It was about creating a space where everyone felt welcome, seen, and valued. A space that stood in stark contrast to the one that had excluded the two small boys. The approaching date felt less like a deadline and more like a culmination, the point where all the planning and quiet determination would manifest in tangible joy. I packed boxes of decorations, paper plates, cups, and napkins. Bright, colorful, disposable, practical, and cheerful. Each item packed felt like a small victory. This party was happening. I was making it happen. And it was going to be everything the other party wasn't. Loud, messy, full of pure, unadulterated childish joy. The quiet satisfaction I felt was a new sensation. It wasn't happiness. Not exactly. It was deeper, more grounded. It was the satisfaction of taking action, of reclaiming my agency, of building something positive out of something painful. It was the quiet power of a grandmother, asserting her right to love and celebrate her grandchildren on her own terms. The day of the party dawned bright and clear. Perfect park weather. Carol arrived early, her car already packed with supplies. We loaded my boxes, the giant balloons tied down in the back seat, a riot of color threatening to escape. Driving to the park felt like heading into battle, albeit a joyful balloon-filled one. The park in Evanston was already dotted with families enjoying the weekend. Finding the pavilion was easy. It was larger than I remembered, with plenty of picnic tables and open space around it. We started setting up, working efficiently, the way we used to setting up displays at the library. Streamers were hung, tablecloths spread, the area for the face painter marked out. The giant balloons were tethered to the corners of the pavilion, bobbing cheerfully in the gentle breeze. They were visible from a distance, a beacon of color and celebration. The custom cake arrived, even more spectacular in person. The baker carefully placed it on the central table. The T-Rex looked fierce. The train looked ready to chug. It was a masterpiece, a silent testament to the care and effort that had gone into this day. As guests started arriving, the atmosphere shifted from quiet preparation to lively anticipation. Ethan and Sam were among the first to arrive, their faces lighting up as they saw the setup. They ran towards the balloons, their laughter echoing across the park. It was the sound I had been missing, the sound I had fought to create. Mark and Sarah weren't with them. The boys had been dropped off by a neighbor, who lingered just long enough to say hello before hurrying away. This felt deliberate, another layer of distance, a refusal to even witness the event. It stung, but only for a moment. My focus was immediately pulled back to the boys, to their excitement. Ethan pointed excitedly at the T-Rex on the cake. Sam made train noises, mimicking a locomotive. Their joy was pure, uninhibited. It was everything I had hoped for. The party was a success. Kids ran and played on the playground, chased balloons, got their faces painted. Parents chatted, grateful for a relaxed, child-focused gathering. My family members mingled, making sure the boys felt special, showering them with attention. Carol was everywhere, making sure everything ran smoothly, a quiet, supportive presence. The noise level rose, laughter, shrieks, the general happy chaos of a successful kids' party. It was loud, it was messy, it was perfect. I watched Ethan and Sam, their faces smudged with cake frosting and face paint, their clothes slightly rumpled, their eyes bright with happiness. This was why I had done this. Not for show, not for status, but for this, for their unadulterated joy, for their feeling of being celebrated and cherished. My heart felt full, a warmth spreading through my chest that chased away the lingering coldness of the previous weeks. There was a moment, quiet and personal, when I sat on a bench watching the boys attempt to scale the playground equipment. Ethan, focused and determined. Sam, giggling as he slid down. They were just kids, being kids, and they deserved to have moments like this. Moments of pure, uncomplicated fun, surrounded by people who loved them unconditionally. It struck me then that this party wasn't just for them. It was for me too. It was a vital, tangible manifestation of my love, a love that refused to be sidelined or diminished. It was proof that I could create my own space, my own moments of joy, independent of the limitations or exclusions imposed by others. It was a reclamation of my own power, my own identity, my own worth. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky as the party wound down. Tired, happy children were rounded up by their parents. Leftover cake was wrapped, balloons were gathered. As people thanked me, telling me what a wonderful time they had, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle over me. It wasn't triumph over Mark and Sarah, it was personal fulfillment. I had set out to do something difficult and emotionally charged, and I had done it. I had created a bubble of pure joy for my grandsons, a memory they would hopefully carry with them, a memory of being the center of a celebration, of being loved loudly and unequivocally. As the last guest departed, leaving behind scattered napkins and deflated balloons, Carol and I began the cleanup. The pavilion looked a little messy, but it was a good mess. The remnants of laughter and fun. We worked in comfortable silence, the quiet a welcome change after the cheerful noise of the party. My body was tired, my feet ached, but I felt energized in a way I hadn't in months. It was the fatigue that comes after purposeful effort, a satisfying exhaustion. You did good, Jean, Carol said, stacking chairs. Really good. I smiled. A genuine, relaxed smile this time. We did good, Carol, I corrected her. I couldn't have done it without you. Her friendship, her willingness to dive into this quiet project with me, had been invaluable. It was another reminder that connection and support came in many forms, not always from the places you expected them to. The boys were picked up by Mark, who arrived just as we were finishing the final sweep. He looked tired, perhaps from his own party the week before. He didn't comment on the balloons, the leftover cake box, or the general air of happy exhaustion that hung around the pavilion. He simply thanked me for watching the boys, ushered them into his car, and drove away. No questions about the party, no acknowledgement of the effort, no apology for the reason it had been necessary. The silence from him was, again, telling. But this time, it didn't sting as much. His world and my world had diverged, and I was okay with that. I had created a space where the boys were loved and celebrated, a space that didn't require his approval or participation. That space was mine. Driving home in my quiet car, the deflated balloons rustling faintly in the back, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the peace of reconciliation or of resolution with Mark and Sarah. It was a different kind of peace, the peace of self-possession. I had taken a situation that had made me feel powerless and had turned it into an opportunity to assert my own values, to demonstrate my own love, to reclaim my own dignity. My small house in Evanston felt different when I unlocked the door. It wasn't just a quiet refuge anymore. It felt like a stronghold, a place where love was unconditional, where family meant inclusion, where joy wasn't curated but created. Sometimes messy is always real. I didn't feel the need to talk about the party with anyone else. Its success wasn't measured in likes or comments or external validation. It was measured in the memory of Ethan's face seeing the dinosaur cake, in Sam's infectious giggle on the playground, in the warmth I felt knowing I had given them something truly special, something born purely of love. I had taken the hurt and exclusion and transformed it into something positive, something powerful. I hadn't just thrown them a party, I had built them a haven. And in doing so, I had built one for myself too. The quiet of the house was no longer the silence of absence or defeat. It was the silence of peace, of accomplishment, of knowing that I had done the right thing, the necessary thing, for the people who mattered most. I went to bed that night, not with a knot in my stomach, but with the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The story wasn't over, of course. Family dynamics were rarely simple or static. But I had navigated this particular challenge not by shrinking, but by expanding, not by accepting exclusion, but by creating inclusion. And that felt like a quiet, powerful victory. My grandsons had felt unwelcome in one space, but I had shown them, undeniably, that they were cherished in another. And that made all the difference. A few days later, I received a small envelope in the mail. It was from Ethan. Inside was a drawing, scribbled in crayon. It showed a large green dinosaur next to a small blue train, with stick figures of children running around them. Underneath, in wobbly letters, he had printed, "Best part ever. I love you, Grandma." I sat at my kitchen table, the sun streaming in. and looked at the drawing. The lines weren't perfect, the colors were bold and uncontained, just like the party had been. Tears welled up in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of profound relief and quiet joy. This was the only validation I needed. Not a thank you from Mark or Sarah, not an acknowledgement of my effort from the outside world. Just this simple, heartfelt message from one of the two small people for whom I had done it all. I carefully pinned the drawing on my refrigerator, right in the center, covering up an older notice about recycling dates. It was a new focal point for my kitchen, a reminder of what truly mattered. Later that week, Mark called. It was a brief conversation, mostly about scheduling the boys' next visit. He mentioned, in a rushed tone, something about hearing the park party went well. There was no elaboration, no apology, no discussion of the adults-only event. It was a careful, almost clinical avoidance of the subject. I kept my own tone neutral, simply confirming the visit dates. I didn't need him to understand. I didn't need him to validate my feelings or my actions. The drawing on the refrigerator, the memory of the boys' laughter, the quiet peace I felt in my own home, that was enough. I had stopped needing their approval to feel like a worthwhile grandmother, a worthwhile person. I had found my own strength, my own way of asserting my love and my values. The dynamic between us had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. I was no longer waiting for crumbs of attention or inclusion from their table. I had built my own table, a large, welcoming one, and invited those who cherished the same things I did. The exclusion had hurt, deeply, but it had also been a catalyst. It had forced me to stop accommodating, to stop diminishing myself and my bond with my grandsons for the sake of a fragile peace. It had shown me that my quiet strength, my unwavering love, was a force in itself. My house in Evanston felt different now. It was still the same quiet place, filled with my things, my memories, but it felt more fully mine. It wasn't just where I lived. It was where I stood. It was the place from which I had launched my quiet counter movement, the place where love was loud and clear, where grandmothers and grandsons were unconditionally welcome. The path ahead was uncertain, as family relationships always are. There would be new challenges, new moments of tension perhaps. But I faced them now with a quiet confidence I hadn't possessed before. I knew my values, I knew my priorities, and I knew the depth of the love I had for my grandsons. A love that was strong enough to build parties, to create havens, to stand firm against any attempt to diminish or exclude. The quiet satisfaction remained, a steady ember burning within me. I had done more than just throw a party. I had reaffirmed my place. I had protected my grandsons, and I had found a strength I hadn't known was there. It wasn't a triumphant roar. It was a quiet, unwavering hum. The hum of a grandmother's resolve. The hum of love made visible. The hum of a space reclaimed. One afternoon, a few weeks after the part, I was sorting through old papers and came across a small framed quote I had packed away years ago. It read, "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any." I paused, holding the frame. I had kept it because it resonated with a feeling I had often had in my professional life, a sense of being overlooked despite my competence. But it resonated differently now. I thought about the quiet way I had retreated over the years, trying not to rock the boat, trying to be the easy, agreeable mother-in-law. That was giving up my power, little by little. Not with a dramatic gesture, but with small, daily compromises of my own truth. The exclusion of my grandsons from the party had been the breaking point, the moment that revealed the futility of that approach. No amount of quiet compliance had prevented the casual cruelty. It had taken that blow to wake me up, to make me realize that my power wasn't something granted by others, but something inherent, something I had simply stopped using. The power to choose my response, to create my own reality, to assert my own values. My choice to throw the party wasn't about proving anything to Mark and Sarah. It was about proving something to myself, that I was not powerless, that my love had weight and substance, that I could create joy and belonging even when faced with exclusion. I placed the framed quote on my bedside table, a small reminder. The journey hadn't erased the hurt entirely. There were still moments, quiet ones, when the memory of Mark's words, his dismissive tone, would surface, bringing with it a familiar ache. But the ache no longer led to despair or paralysis. It led to a reinforced sense of purpose, a quiet determination to continue building the world I wanted for myself and my grandsons. A world where they felt unconditionally loved and accepted. I thought about the future. The boys would grow, their needs and interests would change. Family dynamics would continue to evolve. There would undoubtedly be new challenges, but I faced the future with a different mindset. I was no longer approaching it from a position of vulnerability, hoping for acceptance. I was approaching it from a position of strength, grounded in my own values and my willingness to act on them. My relationship with Mark and Sarah remained cool, polite, but distant. The incident of the party wasn't discussed, wasn't acknowledged directly. It existed between us, an invisible wall, but I no longer spent time dwelling on it, trying to understand their motives or mend the unacknowledged rift. My energy was focused elsewhere, on nurturing my connection with the boys, on enjoying my own life, on continuing to build my own space of peace and joy. The boys visited regularly, their visits now feeling even more precious. My house was filled with their energy, their laughter, their stories. The drawing was still on the refrigerator, a constant, cheerful presence. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a symbol of love, of belonging, of a grandmother's quiet, unwavering resolve. I had learned that some betrayals, even seemingly small ones, could be catalysts for profound change. They could strip away assumptions, force difficult truths into the light, and reveal strengths you never knew you had. I had lost something in the process, the illusion of a perfect, harmonious family structure. But I had gained something far more valuable, a clarity of purpose, a fierce sense of self-worth, and the knowledge that the deepest connections were the ones you built and protected yourself. Brick by careful brick, party by joyful party. My small, quiet life in Evanston felt full of purpose, full of love, full of the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had found her power, not in controlling others, but in owning herself. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.